An elephant stands solemnly at the river's edge, day after day, gathering flowers with his trunk. Rangers set up hidden cameras, thinking it's just another peculiar habit. But what they capture changes everything. His actions reveal a ritual so profound, so heartbreaking, it leaves everyone speechless. Why does this elephant mourn? What secrets from the past does his behavior uncover? And how does one grieving woman find herself drawn into his world, unlocking a story that will inspire millions? Stay tuned for this emotional journey of loss, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel parking lot as Ellie Brooks pulled up to the Tennessee Wildlife Sanctuary. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white. She hadn't driven this far alone since Richard passed away 6 months ago. "You need this," Clara had insisted last week over coffee. "The sanctuary will do you good. All that open space, fresh air, and those magnificent animals." Ellie sighed, turning off the engine. The silence felt heavy. Through her windshield, she could see the wooden welcome center with its weather-worn sign. A few other cars dotted the parking lot, but the place seemed peaceful. Almost too peaceful for someone who'd spent 40 years surrounded by chattering schoolchildren. Her legs felt stiff as she finally stepped out of the car. The air smelled different here, earthy and wild. A gentle breeze carried unfamiliar animal sounds from somewhere beyond the trees. "Welcome to the sanctuary," a cheerful voice called out. A woman with dark curly hair pulled into a practical ponytail approached, her smile warm and genuine. "I'm Julie Martinez, the sanctuary coordinator. You must be Ellie Brooks?" Ellie managed a small nod. "Yes, that's me. We're just about to start the afternoon tour. Let me show you around first." Julie's enthusiasm was gentle, not overwhelming. As they walked, she explained how the sanctuary had been caring for rescued elephants for over 2 decades. Most of our residents came from difficult situations, circuses, unsuitable zoos, even illegal private ownership. They joined a small group of visitors near a fenced pathway. Julie was explaining something about the sanctuary's feeding program when Ellie's attention drifted to the riverbank visible through the trees. There, standing completely still, was the largest elephant she'd ever seen. "That's Raja," Julie said softly, noticing Ellie's gaze. "He's one of our oldest residents. Spends hours by the water, especially in the late afternoon." Ellie watched the massive creature. There was something in his stillness that tugged at her heart. The way he stood there, so solitary and quiet, reminded her of the long hours she now spent alone in her empty house. Is he okay?" Ellie found herself asking. Julie's expression softened. "Raja's healthy, just contemplative. We've never quite figured out why he's drawn to that spot, but it seems important to him." As other visitors snapped photos and asked questions about the sanctuary's history, Ellie remained fixed on Raja's silhouette. She felt tears welling up unexpectedly and quickly wiped them away. It seemed silly to get emotional over an elephant she'd just seen. The tour continued, but Ellie stayed slightly apart from the group. When the other visitors began heading toward the exit, she lingered by the riverbank observation area, watching Raja's motionless form. "We close at sunset," Julie's gentle voice broke through her thoughts. "Your cabin is all ready for you. Just follow the path past the welcome center." Ellie nodded, reluctantly turning away from the riverbank. As she walked toward her cabin, she wondered if Clara had been right about this place after all, though she wasn't ready to admit it yet. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's small window, casting gentle shadows across Ellie's bed. She lay there for a moment, the familiar heaviness of grief settling over her like a thick blanket. The empty space beside her felt vast, just as it had every morning since Richard's passing. In the common area, the aroma of coffee and toast filled the air. A few other visitors sat at wooden tables, some reading newspapers, others chatting quietly. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" An elderly man smiled as he passed by with his coffee. "Yes, it is," Ellie replied softly, managing a small smile in return. After finishing her simple breakfast of toast and tea, Ellie found herself drawn back to the riverbank. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. Raja stood in the same spot as yesterday, his large form silhouetted against the sparkling water. Ellie settled onto a wooden bench, her eyes fixed on the magnificent creature. Time seemed to slow as she watched him, finding comfort in his stillness. Then, something caught her attention. Raja's trunk moved deliberately toward the water, reaching for something floating near the bank. With surprising gentleness, he lifted a small white flower from the surface. Ellie leaned forward, fascinated by the careful way he handled the delicate bloom. One by one, Raja collected more flowers, mostly white and yellow ones, creating a small pile beside him. "Remarkable, isn't it?" A deep voice startled her from her observations. Ellie turned to find a man in his 40s standing nearby, wearing a ranger's uniform. His weathered face held kind eyes and a gentle expression. "I'm David Collins," he said, stepping closer. "I've been watching Raja do this for years now." "Does anyone know why he does it?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David shook his head. "We have theories, but nothing concrete. He seems particularly drawn to white and yellow flowers, jasmine, daisies, anything with a strong, sweet scent." They watched as Raja delicately picked up another flower, this time a yellow dandelion. His movements were so precise, so intentional, it almost looked like a ceremony. "How long has he been doing this?" Ellie asked. "Since he arrived at the sanctuary," David replied. "Some days he spends hours at it. It's like he's following some inner rhythm we can't quite understand." Ellie nodded, her eyes never leaving Raja. There was something deeply moving about watching this enormous creature handle such tiny, fragile things with such care. It stirred something in her chest. Not exactly happiness, but a kind of wondering. The day passed quietly as Ellie remained at her post, watching Raja's methodical collection. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. She barely noticed the time until David appeared again. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brooks, but we're closing for the day," he said gently. Ellie stood, her joints stiff from sitting so long. As she walked back to her cabin, she felt different somehow. The weight of her grief was still there, but alongside it was something new, a spark of curiosity about Raja's mysterious ritual. The morning sunlight streamed through the sanctuary's dining hall windows as Ellie stirred her tea, sitting across from Julie at a corner table. "I've never seen anything quite like it," Ellie said, describing Raja's careful flower collecting. "The way he handles each bloom." Julie nodded eagerly. "You know, we could learn so much more about his behavior if we set up a camera. Really study what he's doing when no one's around." Ellie frowned, her hands tightening around her warm mug. "Wouldn't that be intrusive? He seems so private about it." "The camera would be well hidden," Julie assured her. "We already use them to monitor the animal's health and safety. This would just help us understand him better." After some thought, Ellie nodded slowly. "I suppose if it helps Raja." That afternoon, Ellie found herself holding a ladder while David mounted a small camera in a tree near the riverbank. Julie stood nearby, checking the angle on a tablet screen. "Raja's been with us longer than any other elephant," David shared, adjusting the camera. "Margaret Grayson, our founder, rescued him herself." What was she like? Ellie asked, steadying the ladder. Amazing woman, Julie chimed in. She dedicated her whole life to these animals. Would spend hours just observing them, learning their behaviors. As the sun began to set, they gathered in Julie's office. The small room felt cozy, with the three of them huddled around her computer screen. Julie clicked through the footage until Raja appeared. There, David pointed. He's starting. They watched in silence as Raja methodically placed each flower on the ground. What had seemed random before now revealed itself as deliberate. The flowers formed a loose circle, each bloom carefully positioned. Look at how he's arranging them, Julie whispered. When the circle was complete, Raja stepped back. He stood perfectly still, his trunk lowered, as if in silent contemplation. Ellie felt tears well up in her eyes. He's mourning, she said softly, just like I do at Richard's grave. Julie reached over and squeezed her hand. Back in her cabin, Ellie sat on her bed, phone in hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed Clara's number, feeling an urgent need to share what she'd witnessed. Ellie sat on her cabin's small porch, phone pressed to her ear, her voice trembling with excitement as she described Raja's ritual to Clara. You should have seen it, Clara. He wasn't just picking up flowers. He was arranging them in a perfect circle, like he was remembering something or someone. That's remarkable, Clara's warm voice came through the line. You know, Ellie, maybe you should stay longer. There seems to be something special happening there. Ellie glanced toward the riverbank in the distance. I don't know. Animals have a way of helping us heal, Clara said softly. Sometimes they understand things we can't put into words. After ending the call, Ellie walked to her usual spot by the riverbank. The morning air was crisp, and Raja was already there, his large frame silhouetted against the sparkling water. She watched as he gently picked up a white flower with his trunk, handling it with surprising delicacy. The sight triggered a vivid memory of Richard in their garden, carefully tending to his beloved roses. He'd always worn that old straw hat, the one she'd teased him about. The corners of his eyes would crinkle when he smiled, showing her his latest blooms. Tears welled up in Ellie's eyes, but they felt different this time. The sharp pain that usually accompanied memories of Richard had softened into something gentler, almost sweet. She watched Raja place another flower in his circle, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes peaceful. That evening, Ellie sat at the small desk in her cabin and opened her journal, the one Richard had given her last Christmas, still blank after all these months. Her pen hovered over the page for a moment before the words began to flow. Today I watched Raja arrange his flowers, and for the first time since losing Richard, I felt like someone else understands. There's something about the way he handles each bloom, so careful and precise, like Richard was with his gardens. I never thought an elephant could help me make sense of my grief, but here I am, finding comfort in his daily ritual. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe I needed to be here, needed to see this. She continued writing until the light outside her window began to fade, filling pages with thoughts she hadn't been able to express since Richard's passing. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Ellie stirred honey into her tea in the sanctuary's common area. Julie stopped by her table, a warm smile on her face. How are you settling in? Julie asked, adjusting her name badge. Better than I expected, Ellie replied. I've been thinking about Raja's flowers. You should explore the grounds more, Julie suggested. There's so much to discover here. After breakfast, Ellie pulled on her light jacket and headed toward the riverbank. Raja was already there, his massive form moving with surprising grace as he collected flowers from the water. She watched him dip his trunk into the stream, carefully selecting pale blooms that drifted past. Where do all these flowers come from? She whispered to herself. Following the meandering path upstream, Ellie kept one eye on Raja while taking in the peaceful surroundings. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle. After about 15 minutes of walking, the maintained path gave way to overgrown grass. Through tangles of morning glory vines and clusters of wild roses, Ellie spotted what looked like old stonework. Curious, she pushed aside some branches and gasped. Hidden from the main path lay the remnants of a garden. Stone pathways, cracked and worn, wound between beds of wildflowers and flowering weeds. Butterfly bushes stretched their purple blooms toward the sky, while patches of white and yellow flowers, the same kinds Raja seemed to favor, dotted the unruly space. In the center of this forgotten paradise stood a weathered wooden bench. Ellie approached it slowly, brushing aside some ivy that had begun to climb its legs. A small brass plaque caught her eye, its surface green with age. Kneeling down, she gently wiped away the moss to read the inscription. In loving memory, Margaret Grayson, Sanctuary Founder. Margaret Grayson, Ellie repeated softly, running her fingers over the engraved letters. She sat on the bench, taking in the wild beauty around her. Despite its neglected state, there was something magical about this space, something that tugged at her heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees as Ellie remained on the bench, listening to the gentle flow of the river and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. This place felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered, a story waiting to be told. As evening approached, she watched the golden light play across the overgrown flowers. The peaceful atmosphere of the abandoned garden wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Making her way back to her cabin, Ellie felt certain she would return tomorrow to learn more about this special place and its connection to Raja's daily ritual. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Ellie approached the sanctuary's tool shed. Her borrowed gardening gloves felt stiff and new against her skin. Inside her canvas bag, she had packed water, a small snack, and a determination to uncover more about the mysterious garden she'd found. "Good morning, Ellie," Julie called out, waving from across the path. "Those tools are free for visitors to use. Just remember to bring them back before sunset." Ellie nodded, selecting a pair of pruning shears and a small trowel. "Thank you, Julie. I thought I might try to tidy up that old garden a bit." The walk to the overgrown garden felt shorter today. Ellie's footsteps were more confident as she navigated the worn path, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. When she arrived, the morning dew still clung to the tangled vines and wildflowers. She started near the weathered bench, carefully pulling away thick strands of ivy that had claimed the wooden slats. As she worked, her hands remembered the familiar motions from years of gardening with Richard. For once, the memory brought a smile instead of tears. The sun climbed higher as Ellie cleared away dead leaves and branches. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she felt oddly energized. While clearing some overgrown grass near the bench, her trowel struck something solid. The metallic clang made her pause. Kneeling down, Ellie brushed away loose soil to reveal a flat stone that seemed intentionally placed. It took some effort, but she managed to lift it. Beneath lay a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, carefully tied with twine that had grown brittle with age. With gentle fingers, Ellie unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound book, its pages warped from moisture but still intact. Opening to the first page, her breath caught as she read the elegant handwriting. Property of Margaret Grayson, June 1985. Settling onto the cleared bench, Ellie began to read. The early entries painted a picture of a vibrant woman deeply devoted to her work with elephants. Margaret wrote about the sanctuary's first rescued elephant, about late-night feedings and early morning walks. Her words brimmed with purpose and joy. But as Ellie turned the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. An entry from October 1987 described a devastating flood that had swept through the valley. Margaret's husband, Thomas, had died trying to save their neighbors. The ink was smeared in places, evidence of tears shed long ago. The following entries revealed Margaret's journey through grief, paralleling Ellie's own recent experience with haunting similarity. But what touched Ellie most deeply was how Margaret had channeled her pain into creating a haven for injured and traumatized elephants. "They understand loss," Margaret had written. "In their eyes, I see the same sadness I feel, but also the same strength to keep going." As evening approached, Ellie carefully rewrapped the diary and made her way back to her cabin. The precious book felt warm against her chest, like a friend's embrace. In Margaret's words, she had found an unexpected kindred spirit, someone who had walked the same path of grief and found purpose in healing others. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's window as Ellie settled into her favorite chair, Margaret's diary cradled in her lap. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned each delicate page, careful not to damage the water-stained paper. "Dear Diary," one entry began, "another bank rejected our loan application today. They say a wildlife sanctuary isn't a sound investment. But how can I explain that this isn't about money? These animals need us." Ellie's heart ached as she read about Margaret's struggles. Entry after entry detailed sleepless nights spent writing grant applications, cold shoulders from skeptical neighbors, and the constant worry about keeping the sanctuary afloat. "Some folks think I'm crazy," Margaret had written, "spending my savings on injured elephants. They say I'm running from my grief over losing Thomas. Maybe I am, but these animals understand loss in a way most humans don't." Ellie wiped away a tear as she reached the entry about the flood. Margaret's usually neat handwriting was shaky here, the words pressed hard into the paper. "The water came so fast that night. Thomas insisted on checking the bridge one last time. He never came home. I found his truck the next morning wrapped around a tree downstream. I thought the pain would kill me too." But it was the next entry that made Ellie catch her breath. "Raja arrived today, barely more than a juvenile. The poachers killed his entire family. When I look in his eyes, I see my own pain reflected back. He follows me to the riverbank each morning, where I arrange flowers for Thomas. Today, for the first time since the flood, I felt a glimmer of purpose." Ellie paused, her mind racing. Raja's flower ritual suddenly made perfect sense. He had learned it from Margaret herself. All these years, he had been continuing her tradition of remembrance. The diary entries grew more hopeful as Margaret described her growing bond with Raja. "He's teaching me that grief doesn't have to destroy us. Sometimes it can build something beautiful instead." Looking up from the diary, Ellie gazed out her cabin window at the sanctuary grounds. The morning light painted everything in soft gold, and in the distance she could see Raja's massive form by the riverbank. Her chest swelled with admiration for Margaret's courage and determination. She carefully closed the diary and stood up. Julie and David needed to see this, not just for the sanctuary's history, but because Margaret's story deserved to be shared. It was a testament to how love could bloom from loss, how purpose could grow from pain. The morning sun filtered through the sanctuary's office windows as Ellie carefully placed Margaret's diary on Julie's desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it to the passages she'd marked. "I found something yesterday that I think you both should see," Ellie said, her voice soft but steady. Julie leaned forward, her eyes widening as she recognized the name on the first page. "Is this Margaret Grayson's diary?" David moved closer, his usual reserved expression giving way to curiosity. Ellie began reading aloud, her teacher's voice returning naturally as she shared Margaret's words about losing her husband and finding purpose in caring for Raja. The day Raja arrived, something in his eyes spoke to me, Ellie read. He had lost everything, just as I had. In helping him heal, I began to heal myself. Julie wiped away a tear. This is incredible, Ellie. Margaret never shared these details with anyone. David cleared his throat, his voice unusually emotional. People need to hear this story. It could really help the sanctuary. What do you mean? Ellie asked, closing the diary gently. Julie's eyes lit up. We could share parts of Margaret's story on our website, maybe create some social media posts about her connection with Raja. People love personal stories like this. And we could organize an event, David added, pacing slowly. Something to bring the community together. Show them what makes this place special. Ellie's stomach tightened at the thought of speaking publicly, but she knew it was important. I could talk about what I've learned from the diary, about Margaret and Raja. Would you really? Julie asked, her face brightening. That would be amazing, Ellie. They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, with Julie taking notes on her laptop. David sketched out a rough plan for an outdoor gathering near Raja's favorite spot by the river. We could call it Margaret's Legacy, Julie suggested, or maybe Flowers for Remembrance. Ellie nodded, surprised by her own enthusiasm. Both Raja and Margaret found healing here. Maybe others can too. As the sun began to set that evening, Ellie stood in her usual spot by the riverbank. Raja moved with his characteristic grace, gathering flowers one by one. The soft light painted his gray skin in warm hues, and Ellie felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. We'll share your story, Margaret, she whispered softly to herself. I promise. The morning light streamed through the sanctuary office windows as Julie set up her laptop and camera equipment. Ellie sat beside her, Margaret's diary open on her lap, carefully marking passages with small sticky notes. This entry really shows how Margaret connected with Raja, Ellie said, pointing to a tear-stained page. She writes about watching him pick his first flower, just days after losing her husband. Julie nodded, adjusting the microphone. That's perfect. Would you mind reading that part for the video? Ellie's voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she read Margaret's words into the microphone. Julie paired the audio with footage of Raja's gentle flower-gathering ritual, adding soft background music that matched the emotional tone. By late afternoon, they had created a 5-minute video that captured both the beauty of Raja's ritual and the depth of Margaret's love for the sanctuary. Julie posted it on their social media channels, and they both returned to their regular tasks, trying not to check for responses too often. 3 hours later, Julie burst into the common area where Ellie was having tea. You need to see this. She opened her laptop, showing Ellie the sanctuary's social media page. The video had thousands of shares, with comments pouring in from around the world. This brought tears to my eyes, Ellie read aloud. The way Raja honors his grief is so beautiful. Her eyes welled up as she scrolled through more responses. Julie pulled up their donation page. Look at this. We've received more donations in the past few hours than we usually get in a month. People are really connecting with Raja's story. The sanctuary staff gathered around the computer, their faces glowing with hope. David squeezed Ellie's shoulder. Oh, Margaret would be proud, he said quietly. You've helped bring her story to life. As the excitement buzzed around her, Ellie slipped outside into the evening air. The moon cast a silver glow over the sanctuary grounds as she made her way to the riverbank. Raja stood in his usual spot, his dark form silhouetted against the water. She watched as he carefully selected a white flower, lifting it with his trunk in a graceful arc. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a deep sense of connection to this moment, to Raja, to Margaret's memory, and to the thousands of people who now shared in their story of loss and healing. The morning sun had barely crested the hills when Julie burst into the common area, her face glowing with excitement. "Ellie, you won't believe who just contacted us." She waved her phone in the air. "Tess Harper wants to cover Raja's story." Ellie's spoon clattered against her cereal bowl. "The journalist? The one who writes those beautiful pieces about people and animals?" "The very same," Julie beamed. "She's actually on her way here now." Just before lunch, a sleek silver car pulled up to the sanctuary. Tess Harper stepped out, her camera hanging from her shoulder and a worn leather notebook tucked under her arm. She was shorter than Ellie expected, with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Mrs. Brooks," Tess extended her hand warmly, "I was so moved by the video. Would you mind showing me where Raja performs his rituals?" They walked to the riverbank together, where Raja stood in his usual spot. Tess set up her camera, while Ellie shared Margaret's diary entries and her own story. "I lost my husband Richard 6 months ago," Ellie's voice softened. "When I first saw Raja placing those flowers so carefully, something just clicked. It was like watching my own grief take shape." Tess nodded, jotting notes. "And finding Margaret's diary?" "It felt like a gift," Ellie said, watching Raja gently lift a white flower from the water. Here was this remarkable woman who turned her pain into purpose. She built this sanctuary because she understood that animals grieve too. As the afternoon light turned golden, Tess filmed Raja's ritual. The massive elephant moved with surprising grace, arranging flowers in his distinctive circular pattern. Between takes, Tess and Ellie shared stories about their favorite assignments and the power of storytelling. That evening, everyone gathered in Julie's office. Tess connected her laptop to a small projector and displayed her first draft. The story began with Raja's gentle flower placement, woven Margaret's history through diary excerpts, and connected it all to Ellie's journey of healing. "In this quiet corner of Tennessee," Tess read aloud, "an elderly elephant's daily ritual reminds us that grief and love know no species, and healing comes in unexpected forms." Ellie dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, touched by how perfectly Tess had captured the heart of their story. Ellie sat at a folding table in the sanctuary's main office, surrounded by colorful flyers and donation forms. Julie and Tess huddled nearby, brainstorming ideas for the upcoming Sanctuary Day event. "We could set up stations," Julie suggested, sketching on a notepad. "One for Raja's story, another for Margaret's diary, and maybe a viewing area by the riverbank." Ellie nodded, already picturing it. "What if we created photo displays showing Raja's flower arrangements through the seasons?" Over the next week, Ellie surprised herself with her energy. She drove into town each morning, visiting local shops and restaurants. At Carter's hardware store, she convinced the owner to donate supplies for the event setup. The local garden center offered flowering plants to decorate the sanctuary grounds. "You've got quite a way with people," Tess observed, snapping photos as Ellie chatted with Mrs. Peterson from the bakery about providing refreshments. "This whole town is coming together because of you." Ellie felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time since Richard's passing, she had a purpose that got her out of bed each morning. She found herself making lists late into the night, planning activities and coordinating volunteers. At the local coffee shop, she overheard people talking about Raja's story. "Did you see that video?" they'd ask. "The elephant who arranges flowers. It's right here in our town." Tess followed Ellie's progress, capturing moments both big and small. Ellie explaining Raja's story to potential donors, working with high school students who volunteered to help, and quiet moments when she sat alone, reading Margaret's diary for inspiration. The evening before the event, Ellie and Julie stood at the riverbank. The setting sun painted the water gold, and Raja moved slowly among the flowers, his ritual as peaceful as ever. "I can't thank you enough," Julie said softly. "You've brought something special to this place." Ellie watched Raja gather another flower. "Actually, I should be thanking you," she replied. "This sanctuary, Raja, it's given me a reason to keep going. After Richard died, I didn't think I'd find that again." The elephant placed his flower carefully among the others, and both women stood in comfortable silence, watching the gentle giant's evening ritual. The sun painted the morning sky in soft pinks and oranges as Ellie made her way to the riverbank. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her blouse, thinking about the speech she would give later. Raja stood in his usual spot, his massive form a calming presence against the brightening horizon. "I could use some of your peace right now," she whispered, settling onto a nearby bench. Raja's trunk dipped into the water, carefully selecting a white flower. The gentle splash of water and his methodical movements helped steady Ellie's nerves. By mid-morning, cars filled the sanctuary's parking lot. Families, couples, and curious locals streamed through the entrance, drawn by the story that had touched so many hearts. Tess moved through the crowd with her camera, capturing the excitement on visitors' faces as they discovered the photo displays and learned about Raja's unique rituals. Standing at the podium near the riverbank, Ellie's voice wavered as she began her speech. "When I first came to this sanctuary, I was lost in grief," she said, her eyes finding Raja in the distance. "But then I discovered Margaret Grayson's diary, and through her words, I found something extraordinary. Like Margaret, Raja understood loss. His flower rituals aren't just beautiful. They're a reminder that healing comes in many forms." The crowd listened intently as Ellie shared passages from Margaret's diary. Children pressed against the viewing fence, wide-eyed as Raja performed his ritual. Parents wiped away tears, moved by the connection between human and animal grief. As the sun began to set, Ellie, Julie, and David gathered on the office porch. Empty paper cups and program booklets littered the grounds, evidence of the day's success. "The donation box is overflowing," Julie announced, her eyes bright with happy tears. "And we've got dozens of new monthly supporters signed up." David nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "Margaret would have loved this," he said quietly. Ellie leaned back in her chair, feeling both exhausted and deeply content. The sanctuary had given her more than she could have imagined, not just healing, but a new sense of purpose. As she watched Raja's silhouette by the riverbank, she knew she had found her place in this story of loss, hope, and renewal. Ellie sat in her cozy cabin, sipping her morning coffee and smiling at the thank you cards from fundraiser attendees spread across her small table. The event's success still warmed her heart. They had raised enough money to cover the sanctuary's expenses for several months. A knock at the door interrupted her peaceful reflection. Julie stood there, her usually cheerful face drawn with worry. "Ellie, we need to talk." Julie's hands shook as she held out an official-looking letter. "It's from Thomas Wallace, the owner of the property next to the riverbank. He's threatening legal action against the sanctuary." Ellie's stomach dropped as she read the letter. Thomas Wallace claimed Raja had been trespassing on his land to gather flowers, allegedly causing property damage. Her hands trembled as she reached the part demanding Raja's removal, or worse, euthanization if his behavior couldn't be controlled. "We need to meet with David right away," Julie said softly. In the sanctuary's main office, David paced back and forth while Ellie and Julie sat in worn chairs. The morning sun streamed through dusty windows, but the room felt cold despite the warmth. "This is ridiculous," David muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Raja's been gathering flowers here for years without any complaints." Ellie's throat tightened. "This is my fault. If we hadn't made that video go viral—" "No, Ellie," Julie interrupted firmly. "You helped save this sanctuary. We'll figure this out." but Ellie couldn't shake the guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. The viral video had brought attention and donations, but it had also put Raja in the spotlight, and now in danger. As evening approached, Ellie walked slowly to the riverbank. Raja stood in his usual spot, carefully selecting flowers with his trunk. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, and tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she watched him arrange the delicate blooms. "I won't let anything happen to you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." She stood there until the sky turned purple, watching Raja's gentle movements and feeling a fierce determination grow within her. This sanctuary had given her purpose when she needed it most. Now it was her turn to fight for Raja and everything Margaret had built. The morning sun filtered through the sanctuary's office windows as Ellie joined Julie, David, and Tess around the conference table. Coffee cups and worried faces dotted the wooden surface.
"We need Raja means to this community," Woot has said, leaning forward. "The online support we've already gotten, it proves people care about his story."
Julie nodded eagerly. A social media campaign could work. We could use Vash Save Raja to share his impact. But what if it backfires? Ellie wrung her hands. What if Mr. Wallace gets more upset? David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We have to try something, Ellie. Raja's life depends on it." Throughout the morning, Ellie worked the phones, calling local business owners and community leaders she'd met during the fundraiser. Many remembered Raja's gentle presence and promised their support. "Mrs. Chen from the flower shop already shared her story," Julie announced, showing Ellie her phone. She wrote about how Raja's flower arrangements brought more customers to her store after our video went viral. In the afternoon, Tess set up her camera near Raja's riverbank. Ellie sat on a wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Just speak from your heart," Tess encouraged. Ellie took a deep breath. "When I first came here, I was lost in grief after losing my husband," she began, her voice growing stronger. "But watching Raja's daily rituals showed me that healing is possible. He's not just an elephant. He's a symbol of hope for anyone who's ever felt broken." Behind her, Raja gathered flowers with his usual quiet grace, as if performing for the camera. Tess captured it all, his gentle movements, the sunlight dancing on the water, and Ellie's tears as she shared her story. By evening, the team gathered around Julie's laptop to watch the finished video. Tess had woven together Ellie's interview with footage of Raja's flower ceremonies and testimonials from community members. The sanctuary staff posted it online with the hashtag #JarchanSaveRaja. Ellie watched the first comments appear, her heart pounding. "Look," Julie pointed to the screen. "People are already sharing it." The morning sun filtered through the trees as Ellie made her way back to Margaret's abandoned garden. Her spade clinked softly against stones as she walked, and the morning dew still clung to the overgrown grass around her feet. She felt drawn to this peaceful spot, sensing there might be more secrets waiting to be uncovered. "There has to be something else here," she whispered to herself, kneeling beside the weathered bench. Her fingers traced the damp earth as she began to clear away years of accumulated leaves and soil. Working methodically, Ellie removed layers of debris. Her hands moved carefully around the roots of wild roses that had claimed the space. The morning passed quietly as she worked, accompanied only by birdsong and the distant sounds of the sanctuary. Near midday, her spade struck something solid with a hollow ring. Ellie's heart quickened as she brushed away the dirt, revealing the corner of a rusty tin box. With trembling fingers, she eased it from its earthen bed. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, wiping decades of grime from the lid. The box was about the size of a shoebox, its metal surface pitted with age, but still intact. She carefully worked the lid open, holding her breath. Inside, protected from the elements, lay a treasure trove of memories. Ellie lifted out a stack of black and white photographs, their edges slightly curled. The first showed a much younger Raja, still bearing the same gentle eyes she knew so well, standing beside a smiling woman she recognized as Margaret Grayson. Beneath the photos, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was delicate, but the words were still clear. Ellie's eyes filled with tears as she read the first one. "My dearest James, today I welcomed a new soul to our sanctuary. His name is Raja, and like me, he has lost everything. The poachers took his entire herd, but somehow he survived. When I look into his eyes, I see the same pain I feel without you. Perhaps we can heal together." Ellie's hands shook as she gathered the precious items. She hurried back to the sanctuary office, where Julie was working at her desk. "Julie, look what I found," Ellie said, carefully laying out the photographs and letters. "It's Margaret's personal collection." Julie's eyes widened as she examined the artifacts. "These are incredible, Ellie. Look at how young Raja was." She picked up one of the photos, studying it closely. "And these letters, they're exactly what we need to show Raja's historical importance to the sanctuary." They spread the items across Julie's desk, examining each piece with reverence. The photographs told a story of Raja's growth at the sanctuary, while Margaret's letters revealed the deep bond between woman and elephant, both finding solace in each other's company. "We need to share these," Julie said firmly. "They show that Raja isn't just any elephant. He's part of the sanctuary's very foundation. Margaret saved him, and now we need to save him too." Ellie nodded, gathering the precious items carefully. "Let's add them to the campaign right away. People need to see this history, to understand what Raja means to this place." The morning sun filtered through the sanctuary's trees as Ellie sat with Julie, David, and Tess in the main office, carefully laying out Margaret's photographs on the wooden table. The black and white images showed a younger Raja, his trunk wrapped gently around Margaret's shoulders as she smiled at the camera. "These photos tell such a beautiful story," Tess said, holding up one that showed Raja as a young elephant, already practicing his flower-gathering ritual. "We need to show people the deep roots this sanctuary has." Julie nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "And these letters, Margaret's words are so powerful." She picked up a yellowed envelope. "Listen to this. My dearest James, today I watched Raja place flowers by the river, just as he did when we first rescued him. In his gentle ritual, I see hope for all broken hearts, including my own." The team worked through the day, scanning photographs and transcribing letters. Tess's camera captured everything, including Ellie's emotional reactions as she read passages from Margaret's correspondence. The new video took shape, weaving together past and present, showing Raja's decades-long connection to the sanctuary. When they posted the video online the next morning, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in from around the world. "This is more than just an elephant. It's a legacy of love and healing. Save Raja. We can't let them destroy something so beautiful. Margaret's letters made me cry. Raja must be protected." Donations began pouring in through the sanctuary's website. Local news vans appeared at the gates requesting interviews. Julie's phone rang constantly with calls from supporters and media outlets. By midday, the mayor of the nearby town arrived, pledging her support. "This sanctuary is part of our community's heritage," she announced to the gathered reporters. "We stand with Raja." Community leaders organized an impromptu rally in the town square. Hundreds of people showed up carrying handmade signs. "Save Raja's garden and protect our sanctuary." Children drew pictures of Raja with flowers in his trunk. Ellie watched it all unfold with amazement. The story that had touched her heart was now touching thousands of others. She saw her own grief and healing reflected in the comments and messages of support that continued to pour in. As the sun began to set, she made her way to the riverbank where Raja stood, methodically arranging his daily offering of flowers. The distant sounds of car doors and voices told her more supporters were still arriving at the sanctuary's gates. Ellie watched Raja's careful movements in the fading light. His large form was silhouetted against the starry sky as he gently placed each flower in its precise position. She moved closer, her heart full of emotion. "We're going to win this, Raja," she whispered, her voice carrying in the evening quiet. "We're not giving up." The courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade casting long shadows in the early morning light. Ellie clutched a worn cardboard box containing Margaret's diary, while Julie and David carried files of photographs and documents. Tess followed with her laptop, ready to present the video evidence. "Deep breaths, everyone," Julie whispered as they climbed the courthouse steps. Inside the courtroom, Ellie's hands trembled as she arranged the materials on their table. She glanced across the aisle where Thomas Wallace sat with his attorney, both men in crisp suits looking stern and determined. When the judge called Ellie to the witness stand, her legs felt like lead. She smoothed her skirt and placed her hand on the Bible, taking the oath in a clear voice that surprised even herself. "Mrs. Brooks," their attorney began, "please tell the court about your experience at the sanctuary." Ellie's voice grew stronger as she spoke about Raja's flower rituals and her own journey through grief. "It's not just about flowers," she explained, her eyes misting. "It's about healing, about honoring those we've lost. Raja taught me that." Tess presented the videos next, and the courtroom fell silent as they watched Raja carefully arranging his flowers by the riverbank. Julie followed with Margaret's diary, her voice steady as she read passages describing Raja's arrival at the sanctuary decades ago. "Your Honor," Thomas Wallace's attorney stood, his voice sharp. "While these stories are touching, they don't address the fact that this elephant regularly trespasses on my client's property. The sanctuary has shown complete negligence in controlling their animal." The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he studied the photographs of Raja's gentle ritual. Ellie held her breath, watching his expression carefully. As the first day drew to a close, Ellie gathered their materials with shaking hands. The evidence was presented, their story told, but uncertainty hung heavy in the air. She touched Margaret's diary gently, hoping they had done enough to protect Raja's home. Thomas Wallace adjusted his tie as he took the witness stand, his weathered face set in stern lines. He cleared his throat and began describing the damage to his property, his attorney displaying photographs on a large screen. "As you can see here," Wallace said, pointing to an image of flattened vegetation, "the elephant's constant trespassing has destroyed my garden beds. These plants were expensive ornamentals." More photos appeared: disturbed soil, broken branches, and scattered petals. Wallace's voice grew harder. "It's not just about flowers. What happens when that elephant decides to wander closer to my house? Who'll be responsible then?" Sarah Patel rose from her seat, her posture confident as she approached the witness stand. "Mr. Wallace, could you tell us exactly when these photos were taken?" Wallace shifted in his chair. "About 3 weeks ago." "Interesting," Sarah said, pulling out a weather report. "According to this, we had severe storms during that period. Could the damage have been caused by wind and rain?" Wallace's face reddened. "Well, I suppose it's possible, but..." "And in the 15 years Raja has lived at the sanctuary, has he ever approached your house?" "No, but has he ever shown any aggressive behavior?" Not exactly, no. Dr. Maria Chen, a wildlife biologist with graying hair and kind eyes, took the stand next. Elephants are highly intelligent and emotional creatures, she explained, her voice steady and sure. Raja's ritual of gathering flowers shows complex behavior typical of mourning. This kind of gentle, repetitive action is well documented in elephants who have experienced loss. Ellie watched from her seat as Dr. Chen described similar behaviors observed in wild elephants, explaining how they often return to sites where family members had died, touching the bones with their trunks and maintaining quiet vigils. By the time the judge called for adjournment, Ellie felt emotionally spent. The courthouse steps seemed steeper than before as she descended them with Julie and Tess. "Look," Tess whispered, touching Ellie's arm. A small group of people stood near the parking lot, holding handmade signs. "Save Raja," one read. "Protect our gentle giant," declared another. An elderly woman stepped forward, pressing a thermos of hot tea into Ellie's hands. "We're with you," she said simply. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Ellie pulled into the parking lot. She blinked in surprise at the sight before her. Dozens of people lined the sidewalk, holding colorful signs that read, "Save Raja" and "Protect our sanctuary." Children sat cross-legged on blankets, drawing pictures of elephants with chalk on the concrete. "I can't believe how many people came," Julie whispered, stepping up beside Ellie. Mrs. Chen, who ran the local flower shop, waved enthusiastically. Next to her stood Pastor Williams and several members of his congregation. Even Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the hardware store, had closed his shop to be there. Inside the courtroom, Sarah Patel called their first witness of the day. Jenny Thompson, a local teacher, described how she'd brought her special education class to the sanctuary. "Watching Raja taught my students about empathy and healing," she said, her voice steady and clear. "They learned that it's okay to feel sad, to take time to process emotions." More community members followed. Each story touched Ellie's heart, but none more than 12-year-old Sophie Martinez. The young girl nervously adjusted her glasses as she spoke. "2 years ago, my dog died," Sophie said softly. "I was really sad, and my parents took me to the sanctuary. That's where I saw Raja with his flowers." She smiled, her eyes bright. "Seeing him helped me understand that everyone grieves differently. Now I want to be a veterinarian so I can help animals like Raja." Tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she listened. Julie reached over and squeezed her hand. Around the courtroom, several people dabbed at their eyes with tissues. When court adjourned for the day, Ellie stepped outside to find the crowd had grown even larger. They gathered around her, sharing stories of their own visits to the sanctuary. A little boy proudly showed her his drawing of Raja, surrounded by flowers. "Thank you all for being here," Ellie said, her voice thick with emotion. "Raja has helped so many of us heal. Your support means more than you know." Standing there, surrounded by the community's love and determination, Ellie felt something shift inside her heart. Raja's simple ritual of gathering flowers had created something beautiful, a web of connection and healing that stretched far beyond the sanctuary's borders. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Tess stood confidently at the front, her laptop connected to the room's projection system. The lights dimmed, and the video began to play. The montage opened with dawn breaking over the sanctuary, golden light spilling across the riverbank where Raja stood. His trunk moved with gentle precision as he gathered flowers. The footage seamlessly transitioned to black and white photographs of a younger Raja with Margaret Grayson, while Ellie's voice, warm and steady, read from the diary. "Today, Raja showed me what it means to honor those we've lost." Margaret's words filled the silence. "In his quiet dedication, I see a reflection of my own grief, transformed into something beautiful." The video continued, showing Raja's methodical arrangement of flowers, interwoven with scenes of sanctuary volunteers working tirelessly to care for the elephants. Children's faces lit up during educational tours, elderly visitors found peace watching Raja's rituals, and community members came together during the recent fundraiser. Ellie watched as tears welled up in several jurors' eyes. Even the court reporter paused her typing for a moment, caught up in the imagery. The judge, known for his stoic demeanor, leaned forward, his expression softening as he watched Raja's careful movements. The montage concluded with a sunset scene of Raja standing quietly by his flower arrangement, the sanctuary peaceful around him. As the lights came up, a heavy silence hung in the air. Ellie could feel the emotional weight of the moment pressing on everyone present. The plaintiff's attorney shuffled his papers, preparing to counter the presentation, when Thomas Wallace suddenly rose from his seat. "Your Honor," his voice cracked slightly, "I request a brief recess." The judge nodded, calling for a 15-minute break. As people filed out of the courtroom, Ellie remained seated, trying to process the morning's events. She couldn't help but overhear Thomas Wallace speaking in hushed tones with his lawyer near the courthouse water fountain. "I didn't expect," Thomas's voice wavered. "The way that elephant arranges those flowers, it reminds me of how Martha used to tend her garden." He paused, and Ellie heard him take a deep breath. "I'm not sure I can continue with this." His lawyer responded in equally quiet tones, discussing legal options, but Thomas seemed distracted, lost in thought. Ellie noticed his shoulders had lost their usual rigid set, replaced by a contemplative slump. When the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom, Thomas Wallace walked slowly to his seat. His earlier aggressive confidence had disappeared, replaced by a thoughtful, almost troubled expression. The judge settled into his chair and announced, "We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for my decision." He paused, looking around the courtroom. "I suggest everyone use this time to reflect carefully on what we've witnessed today." The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Harrison adjusted her glasses. Ellie's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Julie sat beside her, shoulders rigid. The wooden benches creaked as spectators leaned forward, waiting. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented," Judge Harrison began, her voice steady and clear, "this court acknowledges the unique circumstances of this case. The sanctuary's historical significance, coupled with Raja's documented behavioral patterns, presents an extraordinary situation." Ellie held her breath. The judge continued, "The court finds that Raja's flower-gathering ritual represents a cultural and historical asset rather than a liability. The sanctuary has demonstrated responsible stewardship and significant community value. Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendant. The case is dismissed." A collective gasp filled the room. Before anyone could react, Thomas Wallace rose from his seat. His face was flushed, and his hands trembled as he gripped the railing in front of him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking, "I'd like to say something." When the judge nodded, he turned to face the courtroom. "I was wrong. I saw only the damage to my property, not the deeper meaning of what Raja represents to this community." He paused, swallowing hard. "I hereby withdraw my demands for compensation. Furthermore, I want to donate the eastern portion of my land to the sanctuary. It's better suited for Raja's flower gathering anyway." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Julie grabbed Ellie's hand, squeezing it tight. Tess was already scribbling in her notebook, while David sat stunned, a rare smile spreading across his face. Through the courthouse windows, they could hear the cheers of supporters outside. Ellie felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched Thomas Wallace shake hands with Julie. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous crescendo that filled the entire courtroom. Ellie couldn't hold back her tears of joy as she looked around at the celebrating faces. Through her blurred vision, she could see sanctuary supporters hugging each other, some crying, others beaming with relief. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for weeks finally lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude and triumph. The days following the trial brought a whirlwind of activity to the sanctuary. Ellie sat with Julie and David in the office, surrounded by stacks of donation receipts and emails from supporters worldwide. The computer screen showed their fundraising total, which kept climbing higher by the hour. "I can hardly believe it," Julie said, wiping happy tears from her eyes. "We can finally fix the old enclosures and build new ones." David spread out blueprints across the desk. "And with Wallace's land donation, we can create more natural spaces for the elephants." Ellie studied the plans, her heart full. "What about using some of the funds to restore Margaret's garden? It seems right to honor her memory, especially now." Julie's face lit up. "That's perfect. We could make it a memorial space for both Margaret and Raja." Word spread quickly through the community about the garden restoration project. On a sunny Saturday morning, Ellie arrived to find dozens of volunteers already gathered, carrying gardening tools and wearing work gloves. Local businesses had donated plants, benches, and materials. "I used to be a landscaper," an older man told Ellie as they cleared away thorny vines. "Been wanting to help ever since I saw Raja's story online." Throughout the day, Ellie worked alongside the volunteers, sharing stories about Margaret's diary and Raja's rituals. They uncovered old stone pathways, planted new flowers, and installed benches where visitors could sit and reflect. A local artist volunteered to create a beautiful plaque that combined Margaret's words from her diary with images of Raja's flower arrangements. They placed it near the entrance, where it caught the morning light. Children from the local school came with their teachers to help plant flower beds. Their small hands patted soil around delicate stems as they chatted excitedly about Raja. "Will he come pick these flowers too?" a little girl asked Ellie, her eyes bright with hope. "I think he might," Ellie replied, smiling as she watched the garden transform from a forgotten space into something beautiful and meaningful. Standing back to observe their work, Ellie felt tears well up in her eyes. The once overgrown garden had become a peaceful haven, filled with white and yellow flowers, Raja's favorites. Stone paths wound through carefully planned beds, leading to quiet sitting areas where visitors could reflect. A young boy tugged at her sleeve. "Ms. Ellie, can I plant one more flower?" He held up a small white daisy. "Of course you can," she said softly, watching as he carefully placed it in the soil. Around her, other children continued planting, their faces glowing with purpose. The garden had become more than just a memorial. It was a living symbol of hope, connecting people through Raja's extraordinary story. Ellie sat in her cabin, phone pressed to her ear, her voice filled with emotion as she shared the latest developments with Clara. "You wouldn't believe how things have changed, Clara. The trial, the garden, everything. It's like I found my purpose again." "Oh, Ellie," Clara's warm voice came through the line. "You sound like yourself again, like the Ellie I've known for 40 years. There was a pause before Clara continued gently. "Have you thought about reaching out to Mark? He's been so worried about you." Ellie's chest tightened at the mention of her son. After Richard's death, she had withdrawn from everyone, including her family. I don't know, Clara. It's been months." "That's exactly why you should call him," Clara insisted. "Share with him what you've shared with me. Let him see the healing you found here." That evening, Ellie's fingers trembled as she dialed Mark's number. The phone rang 3 times before she heard his surprised voice. "Mom?" "Hi, Mark," she said softly. "I'm sorry it's been so long." The conversation started awkwardly with long pauses and careful words. But as Ellie began talking about Raja and the sanctuary, her voice grew stronger. Mark listened intently, asking questions about the elephant's rituals and the trial. "Would you—" Mark hesitated. "Would you like to come visit us this weekend? The kids miss their grandmother." Ellie felt tears welling up. "I'd like that very much." 2 days later, Ellie found herself sitting in Mark's living room, surrounded by her family. Her grandchildren, Tommy and Sarah, sat cross-legged on the floor, completely captivated as she showed them pictures of Raja on her phone. "He picks up flowers?" 8-year-old Sarah asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "Every single day," Ellie replied, smiling. "He arranges them so carefully, like he's creating something special." "Just like Grandpa used to do with his garden," Tommy observed innocently. The comment caught Ellie off guard, but instead of the usual sharp pain, she felt a gentle warmth. "Yes," she said softly, "just like Grandpa." Mark watched from the doorway, his eyes misty. "We've missed you, Mom," he said, moving to sit beside her. "I know this past year has been hard." "I missed you too," Ellie replied, reaching for his hand. "I'm sorry I pushed everyone away. I didn't know how to be here without your father." "And now?" Mark asked carefully. Ellie looked at the photos of Raja on her phone, then at her grandchildren's eager faces. "Now I'm learning that it's okay to keep living, to find new purpose. Raja taught me that." The early morning mist hung low over the sanctuary as Ellie made her way to the riverbank. The grass was still damp with dew beneath her feet, and birds called softly in the distance. As she approached Raja's usual spot, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Raja stood by the water's edge, but today was different. With gentle movements of his trunk, he was carefully arranging white and yellow flowers in a perfect circle. The morning sun caught the petals, making them glow like tiny stars against the dark earth. Ellie watched, transfixed, as Raja stepped back from his creation, his dark eyes seeming to study his work. "Oh, Raja," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The perfect circle of flowers felt like a sign, a celebration of life, of healing, of the sanctuary's victory. She remembered the chaotic arrangements from when she'd first arrived, scattered and uncertain like her own grief. But now, just as she had found peace, Raja's flowers formed a complete circle, whole and unbroken. Throughout the day, Ellie sat at a picnic table near the sanctuary office, writing in her journal. The words flowed easily as she reflected on her journey, from the broken woman who'd arrived months ago to the person she'd become. Raja's quiet rituals had shown her that grief could be transformed into something beautiful, something meaningful. "You should write a book," Julie said, bringing Ellie a cup of tea. She sat down beside her, looking over at Raja's flower circle in the distance. "Your story, Raja's story. They're connected in such a beautiful way." Tess joined them, her camera hanging around her neck. "Julie's right," she added. "People need to hear this story. It's not just about saving an elephant or a sanctuary. It's about how healing can come from the most unexpected places." Ellie smiled, running her fingers over the pages of her journal. "Maybe you're both right," she said softly. "Maybe this is another way to honor what Raja has taught me." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, Ellie made her way back to the riverbank. Raja stood quietly beside his circle of flowers, his presence as steady and calming as ever. She approached slowly, a single white flower in her hand. "Thank you," she whispered to the gentle giant. With careful movements, she placed her flower among the others in Raja's circle. It fit perfectly, as if there had been a space waiting just for it. Raja's trunk gently touched the flower she'd added, and Ellie felt a deep sense of connection to this moment, to this place, to this remarkable creature who had helped her find her way back to life. The sanctuary buzzed with excitement as people gathered for the celebration. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, and the sweet scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Ellie stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the crowd. "When I first came here," she began, her voice growing stronger, "I was lost in grief. But Raja showed me that healing comes in unexpected ways." She gestured toward the gentle giant standing near the riverbank. His flower rituals weren't just beautiful. They were a reminder that we all process loss differently, and that's okay. Tears glistened in her eyes as she continued. "This sanctuary didn't just save Raja. It saved me too. And thanks to all of you, it will continue to be a place of healing for generations to come." The crowd applauded warmly as Ellie led them to the restored memorial garden. Sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the freshly planted flowers and the newly installed plaques telling Margaret's story. Children gathered around the weathered bench where Ellie had first found the diary, now protected under glass in a beautiful display case. "This garden," Ellie explained to the visitors, "is where Margaret Grayson's legacy lives on. It's where I found her diary and discovered the true heart of this sanctuary." She pointed out the careful arrangements of white and yellow flowers, mirroring Raja's own designs. Families strolled through the paths, reading the stories and watching Raja in peaceful contemplation nearby. Children giggled as they planted small flowers along the garden's edge, adding their own touch to the sanctuary's story. As the celebration continued, Raja stood quietly at his usual spot by the river, occasionally picking up flowers with his trunk. Visitors watched in awe as he demonstrated his gentle ritual, cameras flashing to capture the moment. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sanctuary, Ellie made her way to the riverbank for a final moment with Raja. The celebration sounds faded into the background as she stood beside him, watching the water ripple golden in the evening light. Raja's trunk moved slowly, deliberately, as he picked up a single white flower. With surprising gentleness, he placed it at Ellie's feet. She smiled, tears welling in her eyes at this gesture that seemed to say everything words couldn't. Standing there, Ellie felt the warm breeze on her face and looked out over the sanctuary that had become her home. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted from the garden, and she knew with certainty that both she and Raja had found where they belonged. With one last look at Raja, Ellie turned and walked back toward the sanctuary, her steps light and purposeful, ready to embrace whatever came next. If you enjoyed the story of Ellie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.